Thank you very much, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from around the world. But before we get to those guests, where we're going to be talking about, they're not from around the world, but they're going to talk about something that happened over at the Vatican, a secret search for the bones of St. Peter. We're going to talk about it because they found it. So we want to talk about that, but before we do, we have an EWTN update about our EWTN News with a brand new officer. We have a new president and chief operating officer of EWTN News Incorporated, Mr. Dan Burke. Dan, how you doing?
Good. It's good to see you, Father.
Well, we're starting to pop up with all these presidents and vice presidents. Now, what is included in your duties with EWTN News?
My responsibilities include oversight of all of EWTN News around the world. So Rome, Washington, D.C., our offices in Lima, Denver. So it's all of the different languages that we offer the news in online, and just the entire gamut of what we do in news.
Yeah, but also in terms of the way that people get it. That includes a number of things. Print,
digital,
what
television.
Print?
The National Catholic Register.
You got to say it. I mean, come on. Well, this guy is not the son of a used car salesman. You got a handle here.
Well, you know.
So it's the National Catholic Register.
That's where I came from, right?
Which is a prize-winning newspaper.
A lot of awards in the last few years. We're grateful. Yeah. We're very grateful.
And so you got that. And then besides the print,
we have our television news, of course.
Yes, news.
EWTN News Nightly, yes, world over.
So that's on the 5 days a week.
Yep.
And then world over, that's a news magazine once a week.
Yep, and then the digital side. A lot of folks are not aware that we're worldwide in news. We had about, last year, just on a few of our news properties, we had over 3 billion impressions on social media, which means 3 billion opportunities for people to read the truth about the events of the day.
Yeah.
It's pretty exciting to be in the news and to advance the EWTN mission through the news.
And as all of us well aware, we're all big kids here, this is a bad time for news about the church. How are you dealing with that?
Well, it's a difficult time. We're blessed to be able to be there to tell the truth about what's going on. But it's a very difficult truth. And so our focus is, one, to make sure that we highlight the plight of the victims. That's a key issue. That we help the Catholic world for the purposes of prayer and action to understand where there's corruption, and then to hopefully bring about remedy, and a remedy that's redemptive and restores the church, restores the faith of people in the church, and gives them comfort that the Lord is at the helm, which we know He is, but in times like this, some people will doubt, and so part of our mission is to give them hope through the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and hopefully it'll help to clean out some of the mess. It's the Augean stables all over again.
Yeah, it's a real mess.
Yep. Well, good. Well, it's glad to have you helping to get that out there, and present something that some of the other news sources might not.
Yeah, and certainly our approach, of course, is magisterium faithful, which is different from most of the news out there.
Yeah.
And so we look at the events of the day through the lens of the magisterium. Yeah. We're Catholics first and journalists second, which means that our values drive the way that we look at the world. And our goal is to advance, as you know, the mission of EWTN is to advance the gospel according to the magisterium. So our goal is to do that through the news. And so it is a tough time, but it's a time where we're very prayerfully and carefully considering all that's going on, and we want to make sure what we report is accurate and well investigated so that the truth can get out and we can come to an end of this difficult time.
God willing. God willing. Well, thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing, because it's an important source. And want you to remember that you can stay up to date on the latest Catholic news. Go to EWTNnews.com. So it's EWTNnews.com. And you'll find all sorts of ways to get hold of that news. we're going to come back in just a couple of minutes with tonight's guest talking about news, somewhat old, of discovering old bones of St. Peter. So stay with us. Thank you very much, and welcome back. Tonight, we want to talk about how an unlikely team of explorers set out to find the bones of St. Peter the Apostle and the first Pope. In this mix is a Texas oilman, one of the greatest archaeologists of the 20th century, who discovered the truth that Jesus made Peter the rock upon which he built his church. This is now laid out in detail in a new book written by John O'Neill called The Fisherman's Tomb, the true story of the Vatican's secret search. So please welcome the author, Mr. John O'Neill, along with one of the contributors for the book, Mrs. Sarah Wynne. Sarah, welcome. John, good to have you here. Good to have you here. And I enjoyed the book very much. Wonderful. You know, it's a great story. We don't have time to go into too much detail, but what is this with a Texas oil man getting involved in there? What's he, digging for oil in Italy or what?
No, what actually happened is in 1939, they were burying Pope Pius XI under the Vatican, and the workmen fell into a huge room, a room full of Russian antiquities. And so Pope Pius XII began to wonder, could he actually prove that Peter was buried under St. Peter's? They went to the wealthiest and largest Catholic contributor in the world, a man named George Strake, and they said, Mr. Strake, they sent a special emissary. They said, would you be willing to finance the most secret and most important project of the Catholic Church? And without knowing what it was, he said yes, in effect signing a black check. He said, what's the project? And they said, well, the Pope Pius wants to see if Peter can be found under St. Peter's. Yep. And that began the search in 1940, one of the great searches in archaeological history.
And of course, this is a search that goes on after World War II had already begun. So, and this is a very, very dangerous time on lots of levels. You know, the Pope was concerned about the way the church was being attacked by the Nazis. He helped to hide and save between 600,000 and 850,000 Jews. And he's got to deal with the Nazis who had plans to kill him and make their own pope in Liechtenstein. So all this stuff is going on. And he was behind the scenes helping to coordinate with the Allies to take Hitler out and replace him with a government that would have peace. So lots going on, and here they're digging for St. Peter. Now, you also, when you say you contributed, did you actually do some of the research, the writings?
I did. I was initially brought on with my legal background. John thought it would be nice to have someone who'd written legal briefs and provided documentation in similar form citations. And so that was my initial job. And then once I started doing that, I jumped into the story, started reading everything I could get my hands on, and fell in love with it and helped edit and contribute to the story that way.
Well, it's an exciting story because at first they had some priests who were doing the archaeological work. How good a job did they do?
Not so good.
Wasn't it they did a bad job?
Well, conditions were terrible.
Yes.
The temperature was maybe 120 in the summers below the Vatican. It was very dangerous. What had happened is the entire Vatican was sitting on fill that the Emperor Constantine had originally put in 300. They found a whole, in effect, a necropolis, an entire city of Roman tombs. And so trying to do the work, particularly because of the Nazis being around, the Pope required that the work be done by hand, by pick and shovel, no big tools. So you've got the Nazis on top, you've got people working below secretly, and the entire project was kept secret. Mm-hmm. So it was a terrible, hard project, but they didn't do it very well. They failed basic archaeology tests.
Well, see, that's one of the things that the narrative brings out, is they did not understand the principles of archaeology, that you look for every detail.
Correct.
It was more the style of 19th century archaeology, where they're looking for the great big find and not paying attention to the details, which is key for archaeology. Is that?
No, that's correct. They were in a race to the middle to find Peter, and so in the process neglected basic archaeological procedures. They did not take any photographic record of this incredible find. They left artwork just exposed in this damp underworld. And so no, they did not get an A+ for archaeology.
No, until they got a better archaeologist. Who was that?
It's an amazing story. They, you can imagine being presented to the Pope. They, Monsignor Montini, later himself, Pope Paul VI, said, listen, we need to get the best person in the world. And it turned out the best person in the world was a woman, Margherita Guarducci, and she wasn't even at that point a Catholic, although she later became very deeply Catholic as a result of what she found. Mm-hmm. They brought her in. They asked her to look at work that had been done and give her opinion. She said, they've done a terrible job. The solution was to fire everybody involved from that project and to hire her and place her in charge, which they did in 1951. She took over the entire project and remained there for the next 25 years in charge of it. She was an astoundingly capable epigrapher.
That's one of the things that's key about her expertise, not only with archaeological digging and all that, but she really knew the meaning of the various inscriptions that she was finding, because a lot of them were abbreviations. She understood them. And the priest had done it, just didn't pay attention. They were just, they thought irrelevant.
She was the most famous epigrapher in the world. She had decoded all the laws of a Greek city-state, which nobody else had been able to do for a 40-year period. Mm-hmm. When they brought her in, the inscriptions that the priest had thought were meaningless were graffiti. She actually spent 5 years studying them. They're among the most important inscriptions in the Christian world. Mm-hmm. They were made by Christians in the 1st and 2nd century who could have been killed at any time for what they were writing. They had to depict stuff in code. So Peter would be a P with 2 keys. A Chi-Rho symbol was used for Christ. They depicted the death of Christ and our hope for redemption through a series of lines. And on one wall, they wrote the name Peter 20 times. They wrote, Peter is here and Peter is near. And that is what gave her the clue to finding Peter himself.
But it took Dr. Guarducci to be able to see that, that she could crack through those codes and not just see this as silly things, but she understood that these were secret messages. That was part of her contribution, key to her contribution.
True, and she verified that when she first saw it, for one of the first things she said saw was Christian men buried near your body, and that's when she said, stop, we're sitting on something big. And so then she started to see the code and the different symbols they would use, as John was mentioning. Then she verified it indeed was a code, because she started researching elsewhere and saw in the Colosseum that prisoners, right before their death, had etched the same markings, and then found the same thing in Ephesus in the caves in Northeast Asia.
Right. See, and that also indicates that this code that Christians used was something they taught each other and passed on and passed around to different places, not just a few people scribbling here and there. It was well thought out at a time of great persecution.
True.
What was it, the year 65, that Nero made Christianity illegal, and it remained Nero's edict until 313?
65 AD, Nero burned out the entire center of Rome in order to build a huge huge palace and statue of himself. He burned the oldest buildings in Rome. People were enraged. His solution was to blame it on the Christians.
Right.
And that's when the great persecution came, the same persecution that took the lives of both Peter and Paul.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, within a year after the fire. Yeah. And because the fire was what, July of 65?
People argue whether it was in 65 or 66, but it was in the summer because high winds spread the fire up the Palatine Hill and through all the temples in Rome.
Yeah.
He captured any number of Christians. He would burn them as torches for his garden.
Yeah, he just paint them with tar and set them on fire as human torches.
In the case of Peter, tradition always said Peter was crucified upside down, that he asked to be crucified upside down. Nero crucified many Christians, and it is recorded that Romans crucified people in different positions.
Right.
And so what were we looking for? What were they looking for? They were looking for a 65-year-old man, roughly, who had been crucified upside down. That was the target of the exploration.
When did they find what were the bones of Peter?
Well, that's a little embarrassing. They found it in 1940, and then they put it in storage without ever analyzing it at all. And only when Garducci came...
Oh, this is the time with the incompetence for doing it.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, when Garducci came, the very first thing she did was take those bones, found them in storage, because they had been found within 18 inches of where you drop a plumb bob down and in the wall that had all the inscriptions. And she sent them to the greatest forensic pathologist in the world, a guy named Carenti. Carenti concluded they were a 60 to 70-year-old man. They still had the nail marks. He had been crucified. His feet were cut off. He had been crucified upside down and placed in the wall that had Peter's name written over and over by the early Christians.
So that seems to be the evidence that it starts walking like Peter, talking like Peter, and looking like Peter, so it must be Peter.
Peter.
Exactly. Yeah. And there was other evidence. They found that the bones had been originally under a marker from the 1st century, designed for Peter. The dirt still adhered. They'd been moved into the wall where they'd been sealed for 1,700 years. They were wrapped in a cloth from the 1st century, purple and gold cloth from that time. And so there was tremendous evidence that it was Peter. Yeah. And there was a great debate, fight over all this, and Pope Francis 4 years ago, after much additional testing by both he and Pope Benedict, placed the entire weight of the Catholic Church behind this, actually held out in St. Peter's Square the bones themselves in a box and said, behold the relics of Peter.
Yeah, yeah. And as I recall, the main altar in St. Peter's Basilica is in fact right directly above the bones of St. Peter, that they're way down at the 1st century level.
Correct.
And there's all that fill and the dirt of time and such that rose up quite a number of feet, but it was still built right over his bones. Is that?
That's correct. Constantine, we believe Helena was possibly in charge of requesting this to happen, but rather than desecrating all of the early graves, Constantine brought in 1 million pounds of fill and just leveled the area over Peter's grave, and it sealed 2,000 bodies under there for 2,000 years. And then the original St. Peter's was built and torn down, and then the second St. Peter's built.
And the original St. Peter's was built by whom?
Constantine.
Constantine. Yeah. Okay. So Constantine built the first one. Why did they come up with a new one?
It was wooden and decaying.
Okay. All right. So
they need to build another one, but it was built directly over Peter's grave.
The Romans were great engineers. Those bones were within 18 inches of where a plumb bob would pass from the top of today's dome of St. Peter's. That's amazing engineering.
It is. It is. And that was what the Romans were famous for, is engineering. Not great philosophers, but good engineers.
And the Vatican has now opened up this whole area. They call it the Scavi Tour. You actually, it's hard to get on, and there's an explanation of how to do it in our book, but you can only do it through the Vatican. You begin down at the very bottom of what was once a hill. You walk up an alley of ancient Roman tombs, which by themselves hold the greatest Roman artwork in the world and statuary. You finally go to very humble Christian tombs. I guess the Christians were going to another place, and the Romans figured that was the end of the line, so they wanted someplace good to spend eternity. You go to the wall where Peter's bones were found and were restored by Pope Francis, and close nearby are not only popes from the 1st century, but Pope Paul VI, Pope Pius XII, Pope John Paul.
In this hill, Vatican Hill, which is underneath the fill and the buildings and all that, I just like to point out, because every so often you'll have some of the brothers and sisters from other communities that emphasize how Rome is the whore of Babylon, and it's built on the 7 hills, and therefore the Pope must be the Antichrist. Things like, you hear that every so often. But I like to point out, the Vatican Hill is not one of the 7 hills. They put that over there. They can watch what's going to happen over there, and the rest of Rome is going to get it, but Vatican is not one of the 7 hills of Rome.
It was outside the walls,
right,
and so
across the Tiber.
It was a place you threw trash, and so after they killed Peter, they threw him in with the trash.
Yep.
And literally only at great risk to themselves, the early Christians came, buried him in a purple cloth, much later erected a monument that still survives today. It looks like a pagan monument unless you look at the inside of it. And they, of course, had to build it that way, and that was all done by about 100 AD. And then after that, 300 AD is when the original St. Peter's was built.
And in between that death and the building of the basilica after the Edict of Milan in 313, in all that time, from 65 to 313, was a time of persecution. And the last one was the worst of all. So it was dangerous.
It was, by the last one, the Christians had become larger than they were in early days, and Helena was the mother of the man who would become emperor. But the story I've always loved is the story of the bodyguard of Diocletian was a man named Sebastian. And they said, look, you just have to sacrifice to the emperor. And he wouldn't, because he was a Christian. So they filled him full of arrows. They shot him, thought he was dead, left him for dead. He got up the very same day, went and confronted Diocletian and criticized him in public, and then they killed him.
Yeah.
So these were people with true grit, the Christians, no question about it. Yeah. Not only would they be killed, but their families would be enslaved, their property would be taken.
Right.
It was a horrible time.
Yeah, really. And, when we look back at this discovery, what kind of conclusions, you've got a background in law?
I do.
Your law degree?
I do.
Yeah. So, counselor, as you look at the evidence, what conclusions would you draw in this case about the importance of discovering this?
I think it's wonderful. I think very similarly, Margherita Carducci at the Milan conference was accused of her faith leading her science, and she said, on the contrary, science developed my faith. And I think whether the bones were actually found or not, I think it's much more important, the Christian etchings and sketchings that were found, and it's just proof that what the Bible says is true, what we read about is true, and it's a wonderful instance where science and faith merge.
Yeah, and actually, the Bible doesn't mention Peter's death because Acts of the Apostles ends in 62. So about 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years before the death of Peter, that's when Acts of the Apostles ends, with Paul under house arrest in Rome, and that's that. So this is something that was passed on by the tradition.
Correct. And the reference to the P with the key symbol, that I'll give you the keys to the kingdom, I think that's a reference to the Bible that is just wonderful to
from
find
Matthew 16.
solid evidence.
And there were Protestant leaders who claimed Peter never came to Rome at all.
Right.
That he never did. Luther questioned whether Peter ever went to Rome.
That's right.
And they claim that St. Peter's itself was just built on a pagan foundation. Well, they were right a little bit, because there certainly were pagan graves under there, but the finding of Peter's bones, Peter's tombs and Peter's bones, seals the fact that Peter went to Rome, that the apostolic succession is proven, at least in Peter being there, and surrounded by inscriptions that are exactly the same stuff we believe in today, carved by people who could be killed for writing that down.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those kind of archaeological discoveries that gives a whole other kind of credence. Most archaeology discoveries in the Holy Land about the Bible don't prove that the Bible is true. They set whether it's possible that could have happened. So you can see the destruction of cities from the time of Joshua and stuff. Doesn't prove that he destroyed them, but it makes it plausible.
Right.
And lots of other things like that, that there's all sorts of, it sets up plausibility. This is more than that, I think.
Father, it's such a hard time right now for the world, really. Yeah. It's in many ways a crass time. And I've always thought, what a wonderful thing. These are probably the earliest fully authenticated Christian relics in the world. It's Peter. It's this is Christ's closest lieutenant on earth, and so on. And he's right there, right where tradition said he would be, and killed actually in exactly the same way the tradition said he was. Right. It's surrounded by inscriptions that tell us that from the very beginning, those people carving them believed exactly the same stuff we believe. Right. That's really a gift to all of us.
Right. Well, we're going to take a little break because we want to give people a chance to call in. The book is called The Fisherman's Tomb, and you can go to thefishermanstomb.com, and you can get the book Fisherman's Tomb, The True Story of the Vatican's Secret Search by John O'Neill and by Sarah Wynne at EWTNRC.com. So EWTNRC.com. It is book item T1863, T1863. Again, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm glad to have read it. And we hope that you get a sense of that authentic Catholic history that we do have. We're going to come back in a couple minutes. We will get to your questions and those of our studio audience, so please stay with us. Welcome back. Welcome. We want to get to your questions. You ready for that?
I'm ready.
All right, let's start off with a caller. We have Anastasia online. Hello, Anastasia.
Well, hi there, Father Mitch. How are you tonight?
Fine as frog hair. Have you ever seen frog hair?
I haven't.
That's how fun it is.
That's pretty fine.
So what's your question?
Well, I had a comment and then a follow-up question about it. Doug Keck had a Father Daniel McCarthy on Bookmark the week of August 12th when I was watching it. And he had written a book called Come Into the Light, Church Interiors for the Celebration of Liturgy. And if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned something about the tomb of St. Peter and its position under the altar, but he talked as though it was more intentional than accidental, that it was a little bit off, that it's not like directly under the altar, but actually, or under the center. And I can't remember why he said that, but I thought maybe that might ring a bell.
Okay.
That maybe you or the gentleman there, or the lady might recall some liturgical reason why they might have done that. But when Mr. O'Neill had said something about how marvelous it was that they were that close, I remembered this thing that the other father had said, and I thought, well, it's even more miraculous because it sounds like they did it on purpose.
Well, all right, so what do you know about this?
It's one of the great archaeological stories. When the explorers originally got to the middle, which was about 1945, they found an entire sequence of altars, one inside like Russian nesting dolls.
Oh, yeah.
The earliest altar had been built by Bernini in the creation of the original of the second St. Peter's. The next one in was from 1100, the age of the Crusades. The next one, Pope Gregory. Next one in was the marker, Caius's marker from the 1st century. They thought, well, the bones will be right under there, and they found indeed some bones fairly close to there. When they were tested, however, they were the bones of a woman. Right next to that marker is a wall, and in that wall were Peter's bones. Now, why did they get to the wall? Well, the great Carducci, whom it's tough to disagree with, thought that they were moved in the process of construction, and then all of Constantine's heirs fought with each other and killed each other, so they didn't finish the work. I personally believe they were moved before that because around 250 AD, the Romans began desecrating all Christian graves. I think the early Christians moved those bones and used that language to hide them from the Romans, but still reveal them to other Christians. Yeah. And they in fact got moved at the time, we know between 250 and 300 AD, of the greatest persecution in the history of the Roman Empire.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting too, because just before 250, the Romans were celebrating the 1000th anniversary of the founding of Rome. And within a year, this chaos and persecution of the church was part of it. That chaos began to develop, and the empire definitely was going downhill.
Father, imagine these immense Roman tombs on a hill, which is where they were. Now, if the people woke up that were in the tombs, here they are, they're 60 feet underground, and on top of them are the church created by the people that they were killing as outlaws. Yeah. And it's an amazing fact just by itself. But I think that the bones were moved contrary to Carducci. Everybody who's ever been contrary to Carducci has been wrong.
Yeah.
So,
but you're going to take the risk.
I'm going to take the risk. I don't think she realized, and we weren't able to date. We didn't realize that they began to actually desecrate remains. The Romans killed people, but they wouldn't desecrate graves, and they began, like the Nazis, to desecrate graves.
Right. So, though it's interesting, Diocletian, who led the last and the worst of the persecutions, his tomb is now a church of martyrs that he killed. So over in the city of Split in Croatia. Ma'am, where are you from?
I am from Los Angeles, Woodland Hills.
Great.
Thanks for taking my question this evening.
Sure, what's your question?
So I had the great opportunity of actually going on the tour, the underground tour of the grave. And I had wondered, because of what you mentioned, all the altars being built one on top of the other, and the last one being built in the 16th century, whether or not there was some record that the bones were buried there, whether they had found the bones and then lost them. I was just curious to know that history.
Here's what happened. Ignatius was a Christian bishop, He was being killed in the 1st century. He was being taken to Rome to be killed.
2nd century. It was
105.
107.
105 roughly. And he wrote and said, look, and I'm paraphrasing, he said, I'm going to Rome, but at least I'll be killed where Peter and Paul were killed. So that put him in Rome. Gaius wrote a letter around 150 AD that said, and I'm once again just paraphrasing, if you don't believe, come with me and I'll take you to Vatican Hill and I'll show you the marker that the Christians have raised over Peter's grave. Finally, the Book of the Popes in 444 AD said, look, Peter is buried dead center under St. Peter's. It also said there would be a great treasure there. There was no treasure, but that's exactly where he was buried, dead center.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
Silver Spring, Maryland.
Great. Welcome. And your question?
This discovery is profound for the church and the world. So what are the plans for St. Peter's remains? Will they be possible to venerate these, or can you explain a little bit about what the plans are now?
You can actually, when you go on the Scavi tour, you can actually go right up and see them, and they're right on display. They were placed in storage for a time, but they were restored in 2013 by Pope Benedict to that location, so you can actually go see them. Pope Benedict has gotten them out twice and actually held them in front of crowds. I'm sorry. I meant Pope Francis has done that twice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So there are, there's a way to, if you get on the tour, which the number of people who can be on the tour is limited because it's a small space. It's not big crowds. So if you want to go to the Scavi tour and you know you're going to Italy, you should probably try to get on the tour a year or so in advance, if not more.
I have to warn everybody, there are fake scammers on the internet who claim to sell tickets. It's the hottest ticket in Rome. Those are all fakes. The only place you can get a ticket from is the Vatican itself. There are instructions in the book how you can do it, but you can also find it online. You have to apply well ahead of time, and the Vatican vets you and then sticks you on the tour for a given day.
Yeah. Okay. All right. All right. Father, where are you from?
I'm from the Philippines, but now residing in Maryland.
Great, great. And your question?
Well, from Pope Pius XII, he was succeeded by Pope John the 23rd. And you mentioned that in 1951, there was already progress in the findings. I wonder if there's a connection between the calling of now St. John the 23rd for the celebration of the Second Vatican Council to prove from tradition that truly the Roman Catholic Church is the true one.
Well, what actually happened is Pope Pius XII died in 1957. One of the great disappointments of his life was that although Peter's tomb had been discovered, Peter's bones had not actually been authenticated. It was not until 1963 that the serious authentication of the bones began, and it was completed in 1966 by Pope Paul VI. So study all occurred and work all occurred when Pope John the 23rd was the Pope. But the epic events, the guiding hand always was Pope Paul VI, Monsignor, Bishop, Archbishop, and Cardinal Montini.
Yeah.
This was always a project that was really dear and important to him.
Yeah, so Montini was involved in it very early on, and Pope John the 23rd, earlier Cardinal Roncalli, was not so involved in it. He was in a diplomatic corps, and he was out of the Vatican and out of Italy for most of his career before being the Patriarch of Venice.
I think they asked Pope John the 23rd, one of his most famous comments, they said, how many people work in the Vatican? And he said, about half.
Yeah, we'll see if they've kept up to work scale. Sounds like a lot of places. Let's go to another call now. Mary. Mary, where are you calling from?
Hi, good evening, Father. I'm calling from New Jersey.
Great. And your question?
My question has to do with the original basilica. One of the guests mentioned that it was built out of wood, and I do recall reading that it lasted 1,000 years, and also that the present basilica has some original parts of that first basilica. Now, was it basically the history of that original basilica, if they can? You know, was it entirely made out of wood? I can't imagine wood lasting 1,000 years.
Well, actually, it can.
It's amazing. It lasted, first of all, through all the barbarian invasions. When everything was destroyed in Rome, that church survived for 1,000 years. The only part of the new church that's from the old church is the foundation. The remainder of the wooden church is gone. There were some things saved from the old church, but not nearly enough.
I think there was actually a partial collapse of the old basilica during a ceremony under Alexander VI. Of course, his enemies blamed his immorality for this as God's punishment, but it was also, it had been creaking for that. Yeah.
Well, it's amazing. The old church, there were over 100 popes who were buried in it. Charlemagne was crowned in it. Some of Giotto's greatest artwork was in it, and of course it was all gone. Unfortunately, that was something that just couldn't go on forever. Right. But it did last 1,000 years.
Yeah, yeah. And it's and it was something that they found. That it was her question. It was entirely made out of wood. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So there would have been the pillars, because Roman basilica style has 3 aisles, and so there would be pillars holding it up, but they'd be wooden pillars.
It was all wood, according to the accounts of it. Of course, it's long gone.
Right.
What we have is just pictures of, engravings of what it was. Supposedly it was all wood. Of course, it wasn't a basilica-style church. It was, a different style, and but it was quite large for the time it was there. And the foundation of the current St. Peter's is exactly the same foundation that was used for that church. It was not disturbed. That was a compromise made with all the people who hated to see the old church vanish.
Sure. Well, it's also worth noting that Constantine also gave the basilica on the Lateran Hill that is now known as St. John's, and that is the official cathedral of Rome. And also St. Paul outside the walls, which was a basilica style, and he gave that as well.
And at the very same time, he built a great church over the grave of John outside of Ephesus that sadly was destroyed in the invasions. But you can still see the empty grave of John on that hillside outside of Ephesus and the ruins of the church.
And there are still sections of the Holy Sepulchre Church that you can see are from Constantine, and some of the floor of the church in Gethsemane. Church of the Agony is also some of that ancient stuff, and the church in Bethlehem.
In the Vatican, there is a statue of Helena, who inspired the building of St. Peter's. I've always thought it is amazing. The statue is looking down, and looking down as if it is looking right into the necropolis, right where St. Peter was located.
I never noticed that. That's interesting. Now, among the popes who showed this, the first one, did Pope Benedict actually display the bones?
No.
It was just Francis.
It began with Francis. Pope Benedict did authenticate completely the remains of Paul at Paul outside the walls.
That's right. During the year of St. Paul.
Exactly. So he completed that, but he resigned before the announcements occurred on Peter. But he definitely is the man who initiated the restudy of all this and was responsible for the restudy of it all. And, you know, for which we all need to be very grateful to him.
Yes, St. Paul was beheaded outside the city, and that's why it's called St. Paul outside the walls. And they found his tomb and his bones in there.
They found it. They were able to DNA carbon date it actually to the correct carbon date period. It's right on it was on the road to the old port of Rome at Ostia.
Right.
And the church has been there, you know, ever since 300 or 400 AD. It's been there a long, long time. Yeah. He was able to authenticate the remains of it as being from the 1st century.
Yep. So this is pretty cool because Rome is also called the church of Peter and Paul. You know, both of them are looked upon as founders. So finding the actual bones of St. Paul and the actual bones of St. Peter after all these times, and when there is modern science to verify it, that really does add a great weight to these discoveries.
Well, you realize what incredible courage these people had, both Peter and Paul. Paul left us that great letter to Timothy, I've fought the good fight, I've run the race to the finish. Peter, I guess, left us his body right there. I've always loved the story of Quo Vadis, which is a legendary story, tradition, but not proven. But there is a church of Quo Vadis, and the legend is that Peter left Rome to avoid the persecution, and that he saw a Christ figure going back to Rome, and the figure asked him, he asked the figure of Christ, "Where are you going?" And the figure said, "I'm going back to Rome to take your place." And so he turned around, went back to Rome, and of course was killed by Nero. He was clearly a man of incredible courage. He obviously could have escaped. He didn't have to be right in Rome where they were killing everybody. And both he and Paul died bravely, incredibly bravely, because of their belief in Christ, who Peter knew directly.
Now, there's also something about a curse and some flooding. What's that all about?
Go on. Sarah's always liked this story.
I've always thought this was a funny story. There was a flood during the excavation, and rumor spread that it was the curse of St. Peter, because they were afraid that they were trying to find his bones and shouldn't be doing that and therefore would be cursed. But it turns out it was just a pipe, an ancient pipe that had burst. And actually on our website we have a picture of the flood that shows some of the damage that was done. But it turns out that it was not the flood of the curse of St. Peter. It was just an ancient pipe.
Roman workmen never wanted to pass by a good story. You know, so the curse of St. Peter sounded like a great story.
You had the same thing with the tomb of King Tut and things like that. And it's just people, you know, who are working very hard. I mean, doing archaeology is very hard work. It's labor intensive and detailed and all that. You need a good ghost story to spice up the job a little bit.
That's right.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah. So you got to watch all that nonsense. But this is a terrific job that you've done in presenting this to us and making this book available. And I actually read the galley sheets. Do you have some good pictures in the book?
We have some great photos in the book.
Okay,
we do
good.
Many from the Strake family's private collection.
Okay, all right, good. So that you can get the book and take a look at some of the photographs of the tombs.
Yes.
And
it starts at the oil explosion, and we have many all the way.
What do you mean oil explosion?
When George Strake discovered the Conroe Field.
Oh, okay.
To finance the excavation, and then we proceed through pictures of the excavation itself of Margherita Carducci and Father Farua, and then concludes with Pope Francis holding the bones.
Yes, that's.
We also offer in there some great diagrams, I think, showing how St. Peter's was built over the tomb, so I encourage people to go to the website.
Yeah, we showed some of those on screen so people can get the book and see you know, these diagrams, so you get an idea of what the Vatican Hill looked like before it was filled in and kind of flattened out. The ancients were amazing at that. The same thing happened in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem temple is built on a hill, but Herod the Great flattened it out and made this big square on top by putting in all this fill and stuff and building on top of that. So it was, you know, their own notions of symmetry that they wanted to augment by doing this fill, but was done with donkeys and human labor.
That's another great proof of the authenticity, it just happens to be, of the find of Carducci. St. Peter's is a perfectly symmetrical structure. Mm-hmm. Everything is perfectly symmetrical except for the wall that Peter was in. It supports nothing, it has no purpose. That's the wall with all the inscriptions, but it was left in the construction exactly there. It's the only unsymmetrical feature in the entire cathedral.
And that may be also part of reference with the question we had earlier, I think from Mary from New Jersey, about the asymmetry of it. But that's just because they wanted to make sure that they have the authentic wall in the authentic place where Peter was buried. And there were no feet bones, no foot bones.
The feet, what was recovered is a full skeleton with a few exceptions. 2 fingers were missing, the feet were cut off and missing, and the skull was missing. The skull was not present. Other than that, it was a total set of remains. There is a skull in St. John Lateran, which has always been claimed to be the skull of Peter. Mm-hmm. And I understand that there's a bunch of testing going on that.
To test to see if it's the same DNA.
And I'm not sure if that's true, but I've heard that's true.
Oh, we'll find out. Again, we want to give you some more. If you want to find out more about this excavation and the book, you can go to thefishermanstomb.com. thefishermanstomb.com. And you can also get the book, The Fisherman's Tomb, The True Story of the Vatican's Secret Search. It's by John O'Neill and Sarah Wynne. You can get the book at EWTNRC.com. It is book item number T1863. Thank you both very much for being with us and giving us this information. And I'd like to bless all of you. May Almighty God bless you and cause His face to shine upon you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And again, we can do this program and give you this kind of information only because the network is brought to you by you. That's how Mother was inspired to keep this network going. So please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll pay our bills too. Thank you.